Thank you all very much. Kimo, please.
Oh, yeah.
All right. And so my name is Adam Veggie. I am debating on the affirmative today and will be the first speaker. Is my opponent ready?
Absolutely.
Non-existent partner? Judges?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. My time begins now. I affirm, resolve, the United States should lift its embargo against Cuba. We offer one definition, lift its embargo, the act of the United States federal government fully ending the Cuban embargo by repealing all existing statutes that hold the embargo in place. Framework, this debate ought to be weighed on a supplemental benefit analysis. Contention 1, economic engagement. Warren, trade. The Baltimore Sun 2015 explains that the recent study predicts that the U.S. exports to Cuba would be $4.3 billion, while Cuban exports to the United States would be $5.8 billion per year if the embargo were repealed. This increase in trade has the following impacts. 1, democracy development. According to Foreign Affairs 2015, producing for the world market enables economic growth, and investing returns human capital and upgrading the workforce to produce high-tech goods for the global market. This then in turn will lead to a growing middle class, and once the middle class becomes large enough and articulate enough, it will press for liberal democracy. The article notes examples of this occurring in Taiwan and in South Korea following the rapid economic development of East Asia. Thus, by lifting the embargo, we give the Cuban citizens a chance at democracy. Impact 2, regional hegemony. According to the Wall Street Journal in 2016, China's trade with Cuba grew by 57% in the first 3 quarters of 2015 to $1.6 billion per year, which has resulted in Chinese influence really across the board, according to a former U.S. advisor in the region. Thus, with increased levels of economic engagement, the United States will be able to outweigh Chinese influence within the region because our amount of trade will be greater than theirs, according to the Baltimore Sun. This means that we're going to be able to have better democracy promotion because the United States is a democratic state, while China is going to be directly against this because China is an undemocratic state, which is going to hurt democratization and liberalization in the region. Moreover, according to Professor of National Security Studies R. Elvin Ellis in 2011, Beijing plans to use its influence in Latin America to move it away from the U.S.-dominated trading bloc. This trade amounts to $217 billion as of 2009, according to a report by the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service. As such, it is vital for the USFG to stop Chinese influence wherever it may appear in the region in order to remain the regional hegemon. Contention 2, development aid. Current statutes prevent effective aid distribution. In the status quo, there are a number of regulations in place which prevent the effective distribution of aid from the U.S. and its allies. According to a summary from the Congressional Research Service, Section 908 of the Trade Sanctions Reform and Enhancement Act of 2000 prevents U.S. exports to Cuba, limits the means by which a U.S. person may finance agricultural products and other aid to Cuba, along with restrictions on the types of aid that can be given to the government. For example, Section 206 or 620 of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 prohibits foreign aid to a third country that amounts equal to what that country is providing nuclear fuel and its related assistance to Cuba. This means that the U.S. is actually actively preventing its own and other countries' aid to that. There are 2 impacts of this. 1, poverty reduction. Primarily, the lack of development aid is an issue because it has been shown to reduce poverty. According to a study conducted by the Netherlands Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a 10% increase in development aid results in a decline of poverty by 11 percentage points. Additionally, the growth of civil society, which leads to social capital. First, we must define civil society as a set of formal and informal institutions that make up society between the state and the family. For example, NGOs, political clubs, anti-poverty organizations, etc. This is important because growth in civil society is correlated with growth in social capital, which basically means social trust. In essence, it is the ability of people to work together. This has a number of impacts, according to political scientist Robert Putnam, which include longer lifespans, increased happiness, and better government. Thus, because the aforementioned Netherlands study found that an increase in foreign aid would improve civic activism by 7%, which also would reduce poverty by 3%, we're going to see a huge amount of growth, which leads to all of these sort of benefits from social capital. Contention 3, repeal prevents a unilateral trade war. According to the New York Times in 2016, one of the key pieces of legislation which gives President Trump the ability to unilaterally renegotiate trade deals is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. Currently, the statute is only being applied to Cuba, but could be easily applied elsewhere. And because China right now has $3 trillion in U.S. Treasury assets, as well as nearly $1 trillion in future American manufacturing products for things like airlines, that means that the cost of a trade war is going to be gigantic. Thus, by repealing the embargo on Cuba, we will be solving for all of these harms. As for the reason, I urge you to affirm.
All right. All right. Opponent ready.
Yep.
Judgeos ready.
Yep.
Other Kimo ready. Yes. That would have been great. Anyway. Time starts now. I negate. I offer a definition. Lift its embargo. The act of the USFG to fully end the Cuban embargo by repealing all existing statutes. I agree with the framework with what the affirmation's already said. Observation 1. The act has to prove uniqueness. The Congressional Research Service 2016 explains that commerce regulations have been expanded in commercial exports to Cuba of certain goods and services to empower Cuba's private sector, including authorization for building certain materials and private residential construction. Thus, the Obama administration opens up and the affirmative must prove that status quo needs to be changed in order for a total lift in the embargo to reach its impacts. Observation 2. The act has to prove a bright line to prove impacts or the case is non-unique. To prove uniqueness, the act must also prove a bright line that shows the link between the impacts is significant enough. If they fail to do so, the status quo already has access to the impact. Observation 3. The act has to prove the plan is to be implemented now rather than later. If they fail to do this at the best time, then they to remove the embargo is right now, then that is reason to negate. Contention 1, the oil market. The Brookings Institute 2010 explains that Cuba may have upwards of 20 billion barrels of oil and 15 billion more in unexamined places in Cuba. If we lift the embargoes, Investopedia 2016 explains that multinational corporations will take over production. Specifically, the New York Times 2008 explains that Cuba has a very limited refining capacity in the status quo. If the Cuban embargo is lifted, as Investopedia has already stipulated, the open markets and neoliberal enterprises that would provide perfect grounds for exploitation, something that the U.S. cannot access. This is dangerous, as the Wall Street 2016 explains that China's influence in Cuba is massively expanding, and Chinese investors are flooding their markets. Thus, the negative advocates for Trumpism in regards to Cuba. Specifically, the CNN 2016 explains that President-elect Donald Trump's plan to terminate all normalization with Cuba makes a better deal. This deal, as Trump explains on his website, is not turned against China. Either way, we can screw over China and prevent Chinese takeover as long as we negate. There are 3 impacts. 1. Reduction in aggression. From historical analysis of 1,076 governments, Colgan from American University finds that petrostates in which oil constitutes at least 10% of the GDP are involved in military and aggression more significantly. The Cato Institute warns by explaining that petrostates like China are one of the world's largest oil producers, and these countries, Colgan explains, utilize their oil income to finance military capabilities. However, by cutting off China's access to these oil supplies through controlling Cuba via the embargo, we empirically reduce China's military aggression by 250%. Preventing crashing the oil prices. Hugh from the Wall Street Journal 2016 explains that China has already increased oil exports by 38% last June. If China gets access to Cuba, they will inevitably flood the marketplace as a result. Sub-impact 1, international securities. CNN 2016 explains that banks are suffering from low oil prices, with Wells Fargo sitting on more than $17 billion in oil loans to oil companies. If the oil prices continue to tank, banks like Citi could lose up to $1.2 billion. The Financial Times 2015 quantifies this impact as low prices really impact the price of credit, which exacerbates inequality to America. The New York Times 2014 explained that this would impact over 54 million Americans because the current lack of adequate credit would bankrupt them, causing and perpetuating income inequality and poverty. Sub-impact 2, stock market panic. Political 2016 finds on January 12th when oil fell below $27 per barrel. The Dow Jones fell 250 points amid fears on oil prices. USA Today predicts that in 2016, the stock market already fell $2.3 trillion in response to lower oil prices. But Trump is the one who's going to help work against China through his advocacy because it prevents the escalation of this trend by preventing China from accessing this oil. Sub-impact 3, collapse in Nigeria and Iraq. The BBC 2015 explains that through energy sales, especially those based on oil, account for 80% of Nigeria's revenue. The Guardian 2014 explained that these oil challenges are escalating poverty and inequality, which is a recruiting sergeant for ISIS. Boko Haram is already gaining power in that region by recruiting impoverished children. Specifically, the Washington Examiner explains if ISIS were to gain the necessary resources to launch an attack on American power infrastructure, they would kill 9 out of 10 Americans. Impact 3, energy independence. The National Bureau of Economic Research 2012 explained that currently the United States imports 60% of the oil we consume, and that costs about $2 trillion per year in oil shock impacts. Contention 2, pharmaceutical hegemony. Lightman from MIT explains that the Cuban government has over $2 billion in medical innovation and biotechnology, which has gone to create 8% of the medicines in 1990 to over 80% today, and all of those are given for free, which means it would impact the American economy and destroy a $325 billion industry on the drug market. Thus, in support of American or beautiful lands, I proudly negate. All right.
Should we try and stand in the camera view for CX?
Yeah. All right.
All right. May I?
One moment when we start talking. 2 minutes, right? 3. Yeah.
Can I have first question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so do you have any evidence that shows that Cuban drilling will be worth 10% of its GDP?
Okay, no. What I was talking about is China has to show it's worth 10% of the GDP because then it's a petrostate.
Okay,
so
but
I'm worried about Chinese aggression, not Cuban aggression.
Do you have any evidence that, like,
Yes.
okay.
Yes, I do have evidence. In fact, I specifically state, allow me to search through this for 1 second. And the card comes from.
Actually, anyway, I have a question though.
Yes,
if
that's from Cato
China,
Institute.
wait, but if China already
Yes.
has 10% of its GDP,
Correct.
then how is this unique to Cuba?
Oh, because what it means is, yes, it's the petrostate still, but if you prevent it from getting more of the so if you prevent growth, then it damages it. It prevents the aggression.
But that's not what your study said. Your study said that states which are petrostates, which are over 10% of GDP, results in increased aggression.
Yeah, and then but the specific warrants behind that is that the more oil they get, they're able to finance military capabilities. So if we cut off them from getting more oil, they're not able to finance more military capabilities. May I have the next question?
Go ahead.
All right. So you specifically talk about how there's development aid and stuff, or yes, specifically. Development aid, yes. So what about Africa? Let's talk about Africa. We've given Africa hundreds of billions of dollars of aid. Has there been any significant growth or reduction in income inequality?
Income inequality is a completely separate question from what we're talking about.
Well, I mean, development aid is meant to help.
What we've seen from development aid is we've seen improved economies. Like economies in Africa have been growing over the past couple of decades.
All right.
And we've seen poverty reduction, absolute poverty has been about half.
Where we're seeing the growth in Africa specifically isn't necessarily where the aid is going. So, for instance, let's talk about Ghana. That's the one that I have a card. I'm going to bring it to the next speech on that. But specifically there, we see, yes, we've sent them like $100 billion of aid.
$100 billion?
It's actually spread over across West Africa, but they've received part of it, which is in the billions. There's almost been complete stagnation of economic growth in that region. So why isn't development aid working? Could it potentially because
you're grossly oversimplifying my contention.
So could it be because the government is corrupt and is taking the development aid and using it for its own purposes?
I mean, in that specific case, but there's nothing to suggest that
So the
here
Cuban government is this totally benign agency.
If you actually want to listen to what my contention said, it says
Sure.
that the United States is preventing independent agencies from being able to go in there and give development aid. It's not that we start giving money to the Cuban government.
Okay.
It's that international
So
organizations
here's my
go
question:
in and
is
help
the Cuban
feed
government
people.
Okay? Who runs the majority of the Cuban economy?
I mean, the state. Although
All right.
we have
So
seen
would it
after
not?
this-
So would it? Efficient development aid not have a necessity to work with the state?
On some level, yes, but you're,
All right, so
that's
it
not
does
like
link
saying
into the
it's
corruption
lump sum
argument.
payouts. Like your
No, I'm
entire
not saying that,
argument
but
is
they
like
would have to
ignoring the sorts of impacts that civil society can have. Because the entire point of my contention
I'm not only
was that
talking about
grows
civil society. I'm talking about the initial.
Yes,
part.
you're talking about a different argument than what I made.
No,
which is
I'll bring
disingenuous.
up civil society. Thank you.
All right, can I please see your card about 250% on China, please?
Yeah.
And then I'll run prep as soon as you have it.
Yep.
I would also like to see your Ghana card that you mentioned too.
Card. Okay.
Yeah, the internet's terrible, I understand. Okay.
And what I'm talking about is finance military capabilities campaigns.
Alright, I'm ready for that. Alright, I ran 30 seconds, and I'll start off the top view so I can give you your computer back. But can I read some of that?
Yeah.
I'm just going to, I'll time roadmap it for you guys so it's a little easier to flow. So basically what's going to happen is I'm going to begin on the issue of my opponent misquoting evidence to make it say things it doesn't say. Then I'm going to move down, deal with the observations 2 and 3 very briefly, just to make sure they're not abused in today's debate. And then I will just continue off case. I'll have 7 objections you should flow on their first argument, and a turn and 2 other objections on their second contention. So are the judges ready? Opponent?
Yep.
Time begins. Now, let me begin with right off the top that there's not even talking about the right thing. If you read what this article is actually talking about, it says, for states in which a revolutionary government is taken over, oil increases states' property and ability to instigate international conflict.